Well, first of all, I would like to thank Mrs. Eversdijk and Mr. Peters because they have given me the opportunity to come here and to give you a lesson about the 4 freedoms. Well, I'm Tracy Enta, and yes, I'm a lawyer in Brussels, but I live in Antwerp. And besides that, I love speaking in front of people. Just right now, I like music, and I love doing things which are related to poetry, etc., etc. But today we will be talking about the 4 freedoms of the European Union law. I have heard that you have already had a lecture, a class about this, so I won't talk about the competences of the European Union because you already know a few things about it. But today we will be talking about this very interesting subject, the 4 freedoms of the European Union law. Well, we have 4 freedoms. We have the freedom of movements for the goods, freedom of movements for persons/workers, the freedom of movement for services, freedom of movement for capital. And there is also the freedom of establishment. This isn't a free movement, but this is a freedom, so you always have to put that in your mind. Well, what are the 4 freedoms and why was it actually created? It is important to know that here in the European Union we have different member states, and in the European Union, well, when you see the European Union, you have to think that there are no borders. And the 4 freedoms are actually very important for the European Union because it actually ensures that people can move freely here in the European Union, that goods can be freely traded, and that services can be provided in different countries, and that capital can also be moved freely here in the European Union. And it is also very important to know the scope of this, to know where the 4 freedoms are applicable. Well, you have the EU member states. We have 28 member states, and then you have Liechtenstein, Iceland, and Norway, and Switzerland. And these are the countries who are in the EFTA. So they can also freely trade with the European Union because there are different agreements with them. So first of all, we will be seeing the free movement of goods. It is always very important to know that there has to be a good definition in order to know what falls under the scope of the definition of good. So you have the treaties. It is actually something which I wanted to talk about. You have the treaties of the European Union, but most of the time the treaty doesn't have a definition about something. So it is the European Court of Justice who will have the task to give a definition to a specific terminology. And the ECJ actually gave a very broad definition to what a good actually is. It is every product which can be valued in money and which is capable as such of forming the subject of a commercial transaction. So this actually means that immaterial and material goods can actually fall within the scope of the definition of goods. But you have to put into your head that real estate doesn't fall into this under the scope of this definition. So it is very broad. Even electricity can be considered as a good and can be traded as such. Well, the free movements of goods, what does this actually mean? So, just like I said, the treaties of the European Union are very important instruments in order to know which rules are applicable, and especially for the free movements and the free trade of goods. Well, Article 26 to TFEU actually stipulates that the intra-community trade between the different member states has to be enforced, it has to be ensured. Well, it actually means that there are no borders. It's like I just said, when you have free movement of goods, you just have to see that there is just one one kind of country, there is just one unity so that people can freely trade their goods without any barriers. And we have actually a single market and a customs union. And the customs union is actually one of the exclusive competences of the European Union. And the customs union actually is a very important thing. So when a third country actually wants to import goods in the European Union, he will have to, the third country will have to pay customs duties. And from the moment that the customs duties are paid, well, the product will actually will be considered as it has been made here in Europe, and it will actually have a ticket to freely move wherever it wants to go without having any barriers, etc. And there is also a common customs tariff which is named the tariff. So if someone from Jamaica, for example, wants to import bananas here in the Netherlands, well, the officer of Netherlands will have to check how much it will cost for the importer in order to pay the customs duties which have to be paid for bananas. So it is like a document where you will find different goods, and that there is a certain price that will have to be paid for the goods that will be imported in the country. Well, which goods? It's good to know that the third country goods can enter the Union, but the customs duties will have to be paid, and the goods which have been produced here in the member states of the European Union can also be freely traded. Well, in order to ensure that the free movement of goods cannot be frustrated, the European Union has actually the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, has actually different prohibitions, and you will find them in articles 28 until 30, 34 until 36, and 110 TFEU. Well, it is important to know that there are different types of prohibitions, and I think I will just go to this slide so that it would be easier, for you to know the differences. So you have pecuniary prohibitions, and this is everything which has to do with money. You have the customs duties between the member states which have been forbidden. It's like I told you, from the moment that a goods from a third country enters the European Union, well, it is okay. No customs duties can be paid when it is being freely traded here in Europe. But there are also charges having equivalent effects that might not be a customs duty as such, because when you have a customs duty, you will actually have an invoice, and you will be seeing that it is actually a customs duty. But when you have a charge having equivalent effects, which is like a customs duty, it's not a customs duty as such, but I will give you the good definition of it. Excuse me, so I'll do but never mind. So it isn't a customs duty as such, but it has a characteristic of it. It's a levy which is actually being imputed to a product because it is crossing the border from two different states, and it is being imposed unilaterally by a member state. So this is the definition that you actually have to remember. Normally I put it here, I don't know where it went, but I hope you will remind it. And there is also the discriminatory taxation which is forbidden, and it is in Article 110 TFEU. And then you have the non-pecuniary prohibitions. Well, these aren't customs duties, but these are quantitative import restrictions. So it's not in the form of money, but you will have restrictions, like a member state that will say you cannot import Barbies in Belgium. That is a quantitative restriction which is prohibited in Article 34 of the TFEU. And then you also have the measures having equivalent effect to a quantitative import restriction. And you also have the quantitative export restrictions and the measures having equivalent effect as the quantitative export restrictions, which are actually forbidden in the treaty. We will first of all talk about pecuniary prohibitions, so everything which has to make with money. Pecuniary charges, the customs duties, are always forbidden. Not always, because there are a few justifications, but normally they are forbidden. And the charges having equivalent effect as a customs duty are also forbidden normally. So normally on imported and exported goods, when a country actually says you will have to pay customs duties or charges having equivalent effect will have to be paid, it is always prohibited. It's not possible to do it if there isn't a justification for it. Well, there is also another thing which you always have to remember. When there is a pecuniary charge or a charge having equivalent effects, which is being impeded on the domestic and imported products, so without distinction, normally, sometimes it can also bring up a discrimination. So you will always have to be careful, even though a charge is being... Yes, kom maar binnen. It's no problem. So even though a charge is being put without distinction on domestic and imported products, you will always have to see if the charge isn't discriminatory and isn't like giving a privilege to the domestic products. Well, it's like I said, there are also justifications, and when there is a justification, a member state can actually say, okay, we do not want this product to come in, but we have a justification therefore. So you might have like the European exception. Well, when the European legislator actually says, if someone from Belgium wants to import animals in Germany, well, there will have to be a veterinary organization that will actually have to check if the animals are 100% okay. Well, then you will have an EU legislation which actually gives the EU member state, here Germany, the possibility to have it to ask the Netherlands actually to pay a charge which has an equivalent effect to a customs duty. It's not a customs duty, but it's an example of a charge having equivalent effect in CASSIS. Or if the service benefits an individual trader, it is also possible to have a justification. Gezondheid. So for this, I have an example. Imagine that you are an importer. You live in. You are an importer. You have goods in Belgium, but you would like to import your goods. You would like to bring your goods in the Netherlands. But in Belgium, normally everything happens with the transport actually happens with lorries. But in the Netherlands, you don't have lorries to transport your goods to a place. Well, you will actually have to ask you. No, excuse me. I will restart. So imagine that you have lorries in order to transport goods But in Belgium, but in the Netherlands, you would like to use a train to do that. But in the Netherlands, you don't have to train to transport the goods. It only happens with cars or something like that. Well, if you want that the people in the Netherlands actually use a train in order to transport your goods, well, you will have to pay it, and it won't be considered as a charge having equivalent effect to a customs duty, because you were the one who actually asked to have the train as a transport modality. So you will have to pay it as well. There is also the prohibition of discrimination, and it is very important to emphasize that this article is an intern article, so there is no cross-border element which is involved over here. And the Article 110 of the TFEU actually prohibits different kinds of fiscal discrimination. So there are 3 types of fiscal discrimination which can be distinguished. So we have, first of all, the direct discrimination, which is very, very easy to see. And there is also a very good example in the book. I don't even know if you already had the opportunity to read the book, because normally you had to prepare something.
No, I didn't.
Ah, okay. It's no problem, because I used to be like that as well, so I know that it's not always easy to prepare the things, so no problem. So you have the direct discrimination, and so in the book there was a very nice example of the direct discrimination, and I will give a little example. Like, imagine that you are a country, and in the book there was an example of Germany that actually wanted to protect the smaller breweries. You can say it well better, because English isn't my first language, so say it. Okay. Ah, okay, that's good. Okay, so they actually wanted to protect the smaller ones, and there was have the same taxes for the imported products and the domestic products, but sometimes it is actually possible that a state actually makes sure that the domestic product is actually privileged. So you always have to pay. You will always have to pay attention that this situation actually doesn't exist. Then you have the non-tarifical barriers, the barriers which are not pecuniary, so the money isn't involved here, and you have the prohibition of the quantitative restriction on import, and this is actually a direct thing, So it can be a total import ban, a total export ban, or the indication of importable quantities, like a member state that will actually say you can import like 100 horses in my country. That's it. Well, that's an indication of importable quantities, and that is actually forbidden. And then you also have the measures having equivalent effect. So it are actually things which aren't a prohibition of, which aren't quantitative restrictions as such, but it are actually measures that can be considered as a quantitative, that will have the effect of the quantitative restriction on import. And in the Dassonville case, it's a very important case of the ECG. Well, there was actually, the court actually said that all trading rules enacted by member states which are applicable of hindering directly or indirectly, actually or potentially intra-community trade are to be as considered as measures having equivalent effect to quantitative restrictions. So in the beginning, it was a very, very broad definition. And the Court of Justice actually had a lot of complaints about Article 34 TFEU. And yes, here you also see the justifications for the import restrictions. But I will talk about the Dawsonville case first of all. The court had a lot of problems, a lot of complaints. A lot of people were coming and saying, there is a problem. Like I cannot even I cannot sell my goods on Sunday, etc., etc. And in 1993, well, in the CASSIS de Dijon case, well, the list of Article 36, this is first of all the justification for the import restrictions. It's like if there are justifications, a country can actually say like, okay, we want to restrict the import, but we actually have good reasons so that these goods doesn't enter our country, so that those goods don't enter our country. You have Article 36 TFEU, and there is also the case law of the European Court of Justice, and I will talk about it here, because the CASSIS de Dijon case actually said that the list of Article 36 is not exhaustive, so there can also be other mandatory requirements, for example, in the context of the defense of consumers, etc., but those justifications aren't in the treaty in Article 36. So there are other requirements that can actually ensure and make sure that the person, that the country, that the member state actually says that the member states won't accept that the goods will be imported. And it is also very important to emphasize that this case law, the CASSIS de Dijon case, actually created, the Court of Justice actually created the concept of the lawfully marketed products. So a member state has the obligation actually to accept the goods which have been created in other member states. So I'll give you a little example. Imagine that in Germany, in order to create good orange juice, you also have to put lemon in it. But in France, in order to create good orange juice, you don't have to put lemon in it. Well, if the French importer wants to import his French orange juice to Germany, the German officers won't be able to say, no, we don't want you to import this French orange juice because there is no lemon in it. Well, all the member states have the obligation to accept the goods which have been created in other member states and which will be imported in the guest country. And that is the principle of lawfully marketed products. When it is accepted that a good has been produced very well in a country, well, the other country will have to trust that the good is okay and won't be able to put other requirements on it, because there is the rule of equivalency as well. Well, the rule of reason is just like I said. You have Article 36, and the rule of reason in order to justify the restrictions on the imports of goods. And here we have the non-tarifical barriers. So you have the CASSIS de Dijon that actually said the justification list for the quantitative restriction on imports is not exhaustive. We have extra mandatory requirements and the mutual recognition. But then we also have the KEK case of 1993. It is like I said, at a certain moment, the European Court of Justice actually had a lot of complaints from different people, from different member states, from people who were actually trading. Some people actually wanted to sell their goods on Sundays, but the law of the country where they were actually active, where they were working, didn't actually accept them to sell the goods on Sundays. I will also write it down here. I think it might be easier. So, So the cake case was very important because we have the retail modalities and the product requirements. I just told you that when a member state has actually produced the goods on a good way, another member state cannot ask the country to put like the example of the lemons. The Germany can be able to ask the other country to also put lemons in the juice. Well, this is a product requirement, not putting lemon, whether or not putting lemon in the orange juice. It's a product requirement. But when someone who imports goods in another country hasn't got the possibility actually to sell the goods on a Sunday or to sell the goods on a specific place, are retail modalities. So it has nothing to do with product requirements. And this is also a very important thing because here the Court of Justice in the beginning gave a very broad definition to the measures having equivalent effect. But from that moment, the court said, if there is a problem with the retailing modalities, well, that's not my problem, that's not my thing. You will have to find a solution in your national legislation, but I won't help you at all. You can only go to the courts when there is a problem with the product requirements. Because from the moment that a country actually asks product requirements, there might be a breach because it might be a measure having equivalent effect to a quantitative restriction. And I think I'll give you a better example. So here, I don't know if you understand the cake case well. Because if you don't understand something, you can always ask me and I will explain it. Okay. So when a member state actually wants to justify a restriction, well, there are also other requirements that will have to be fulfilled, met. Well, the measure has to be proportional and appropriate. Well, it actually means that the measure has to be necessary in order to achieve the objective means, and it doesn't have to be disproportionate. Then it is also very important to know that measure doesn't have to be a purely economic, from a purely economic nature. It's like, for example, to protect public spending or national industry. So you don't have to be a protectionist. It has to be neutral. And it mustn't be a fully harmonized subject, because from the moment that you have harmonization, I don't know if you have already heard about harmonization of the European Union law. Yes? A little bit. So from the moment that you have harmonization, well, a country won't be able to put restrictions because the European legislator actually has set the rules and they will have to be respected. So there you have the measures having equivalent effect to quantitative restriction. There are different types of measures that can be considered as such, like the restriction on use, type approval, language requirements, etc. And you can all find them in the book if you would like to read them and see them. Then you also have Article 35 TFEU, and it's actually the prohibition of the export prohibition. So quantitative restrictions on export are prohibited, but it is something which is very, very rare because most of the time countries want to export their stuff in order to gain money. Like I said, the harmonization of legislation is actually important. From the moment that you don't have harmonization, well, the national legislation can be in breach with treaty. It's the negative integration, and I've heard that you have already seen it, so you plus minus know what it means. And when you have partial harmonization, yes, the measure might be justified, not. And when you have the full harmonization, well, there is no possible justification. Well, that was for the freedom of goods. I hope you're still okay. Yes, I know it's a lot of information. It's a lot of information. And we actually have the free movement of persons. It's also a very nice freedom, because I've heard that there are a lot of international students here. So when you come to study here in Belgium, you also enjoy your freedom of movement of persons. Well, for who is it? For market citizens. And when I talk about market citizens, are all the people, all the persons that are economically active. You have the EU citizens, EU citizenship, excuse me. And you also have the legal persons established in the European Union. It's like the companies. They have also the possibility to freely move wherever they actually want. There are two requirements, very easy requirements. You have to have the nationality of one of the member states of the European Union, or of one of the member states which are in the EFTA. And it is also very important to have the cross-border elements. And the nationality requirements and the cross-border element is also are also two requirements which you will also find by the freedom of movement of services, the freedom of movement of capital, and the free establishment. So you will also always have to check out if those requirements are fulfilled. Well, the free movement of persons, you will find this in the articles 45 until 55 of the TFEU, and you have two aspects. Well, you have the free movement of workers and the right to establish wherever you would like to go here in the European Union. It's nice. Free movement of workers, 45, 49 TFEU. Well, when you see this freedom, it is always important to know that that there might not be no discrimination can be accepted between non-nationals and nationals. So the rules about the remuneration will have to be equal. You cannot pay someone who comes from Spain and wants to work here in the Netherlands 20 euros if you pay someone who works in the same company as the one who comes from Spain. That comes from Spain. You cannot pay the one who comes from Spain 20 euros and the one who works here and lives here in the Netherlands 100 euro. That's not equal, and there is then a discrimination. And so other conditions of work, etc., they have to be equal, no discrimination, everything has to be okay. So that's actually what I said. I also referred to an interesting case. If you would like to, you can also check it out. But there are also exceptions. There are also a few justifications. This right, and you can actually find them in the TFEU. Imagine that you have someone who comes from France and who would like to be like a police officer in the Netherlands. It is something which will be very difficult because I actually said that no discrimination is accepted, but sometimes when it is like a public, when it is like a job which is related to a public authority, competences, well, there might be a justification. Someone who would like to be a police officer in Belgium but has the Dutch nationality won't be able to be a police officer because there is like Article 51 TFEU or Article 45 for TFEU who actually says that the person might have the nationality of the country in order to exercise those public powers, the powers which have been given by the state. You also have other restrictions or other justifications, like restrictions here. And it's like the public security, the public policy, the public health. Like, for example, if there is a very important disease, like, for example, Ebola, it's maybe a little bit extreme, then it might be justified not letting the person in the country in order to protect the health of other people. But it is also very important that the measure is proportionated. Always. It is something which you always have to put in mind. And we also have the free movement of services. And the free movement of services is regulated in Articles 56 until 62 of the TFEU. And it is actually the right for self-employed people, for example. It's most of the time people like doctors who would like to go and work somewhere else. And they actually have the right to go to other countries of the European Union and to offer their services. And it is actually a rule here in the European Union that diplomas of other countries have to be recognized as being okay, valid in another member state. Well, when do we actually have a service? There are a few conditions that have to be met. Well, there has to be something, an economic aspect, a remuneration. So the person that will be providing the service has to be paid. And it's also very important because this is the difference with the free establishment. When someone goes somewhere to provide a service, he doesn't stay there for a long time. So the duration aspect is very important. There is a short duration. And there has to be a cross-border element, which means that the person actually goes to another country in order to provide the service. Then I go to the other slides. Well, the freedom of, to offer services has a different regulations, which there are different regulations which are applicable on it. And the free establishments, well, there are also different regulations which are applicable here. When you have your freedom, when you exercise your freedom to offer services in other countries, your home country rules will be applicable. So not the country of the state where you will actually provide the services. When you exercise your right of free establishment, well, the rules of the guest country will be applicable. And here it is like, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And the duration aspect is important. There are also restrictions on these rights, of course. And when you also have the freedom of establishment, it is also important to know that you can actually start up agencies, branches, subsidiaries in other countries. So you can have a network of different companies. And there are also the restrictions. The restrictions which are applicable on freedom of the freedom of movement of persons and the freedom of movement of goods are also applicable over here. And it is always important to know that a restriction, the proportionality rules have to be respected, and it has to be appropriate. There are also a lot of barriers like nationality requirements and establishment and residence requirements that might actually frustrate the free movements of persons, and these are actually things which are prohibited by the by the European legislations as well. And the freedom of movement of capital is something which I won't see, because I think that I've told you that I've spoken a lot today, and I hope that you will keep in mind the things that I've said. And I would like to thank you a lot for your attention. And if you have questions, you can always send me an email to my personal address. Thank you.